Right, so we just finished filming episode 2 and welcome to episode 3. In this video, we're going to get the car to a point where we can crank it over and hopefully it will start, because in the last episode, we did everything to do with the tune and the wiring. It's all ready to go, but the engine isn't. So we're going to fix that. Right, so we got a good bit of work that we need to get done in this episode in order to get the car ready to run again for the first time in like 14 months or however long it's been. As you've just seen, I've started off with the most simple one, which was putting petrol into the car because there was no petrol in the car. Now, next up, because we are running the turbo on the car, we need to run an oil feed and an oil return to the turbo. So I'm going to start off by doing the oil return, which means taking the oil pan off, drilling it, welding a little return pipe, and then connecting a hose from the turbo. Let's get into it. So we are here under the car. I got this bit of oil hose that I want to run into here. I've already removed all the 10mm bolts holding the pan on, and it took a good bit of persuasion. I had to pry that open without like damaging the aluminium, but now I think we can try and pull it off. Right, little plot twist, had to drop this down, had to undo those two balls so I could drop this down because the oil pan would not go past the bottom bar. But now we have it out. There's the internals of the engine. And here we have the oil pan. With the oil pan off the car, I used the wire brush to clean down the rust and then applied some rust converter onto the oil pan. Once the rust converter dried, I started to drill it. Next up, I welded a small piece of pipe onto the oil pan. And then painted it using some high temperature black paint. Once the paint had dried, I started removing the old sealant and cleaning down the mating surface of the oil pan. With the oil pan nice and clean, it was time to apply some gasket maker. I then cleaned down the mating surface of the block before reinstalling the oil pan. With the oil return done, we're now going to move on to the oil feed. So we're going to take that out. That is a high pressure oil gallery. We're going to drill it out, re-tap it for a bigger banjo bolt, and then we're going to tap into that with the original oil line from the turbo, and we're going to run it into here. We're going to cut the pipe and join it with some rubber hose. So let's get into it. Look, what did I say? Look at that. That actually worked so well. I would like to say a huge thank you to Smart Part Motor Factors for helping out with this next section of the video. Since the Micra had been sitting for so long without running, part of the work we had to do to get it running again was a basic service including oil filter, plugs, just the basic stuff. So a huge thank you going out to them for sending out all of these bits. And the best part is I've teamed up with them to offer you guys 10% off when you're buying from them. They've got great prices on quality parts and also offer nationwide delivery. And all you got to do to get 10% off is let them know that I, the mintiest Micra, sent you. Get in touch with them with the information on screen or using the links in the description of this video, but for now, let's carry on with the service. The Micra is overall a super simple car to work on, and to service it is super easy. There's really not much to it. Keep in mind we have removed the oil pan and there is no oil in the engine, so the first thing we had to do was remove the oil filter, which was a bit too tight to get off by hand. See, I'm telling you, a race car, we do everything like by the book. Using our super professional technique, we eventually got the old oil filter off. Next up, it was time to install a new crush washer to the sump plug, which was as easy as taking the old one off, putting the new one on, and then tightening the sump plug. At this point, all of the oil had drained and it was time to install the new oil filter, which was as simple as that. And next up, it was time to put oil into the engine, and you might be wondering why I'm removing the cam cover. You might remember that almost a year ago I changed a head gasket on the engine for 2 new ones to lower compression, and since then the engine hasn't cranked over. I wanted to make sure that everything was well lubricated, so I took off the cam cover and made sure that everything was well lubricated. Also, when we did the head gaskets, we did not have a torque wrench that would go up to the 200 and something Newton meters that the cam bolts needed, so we made sure to torque them to spec now. And that was it done. It was time to close up the engine. We then tested to see if we could get any compression by cranking the engine over by hand, which we did. If we hadn't, there would have been a massive issue. The next day I decided to change out the alternator belt as it was super worn out. Smart Part manufacturers were kind enough to send out this new alternator belt, which compared to the old one is absolutely mint. It was just a matter of loosening the tensioner, which was actually built into the bracket for the alternator, if that makes sense, and then taking the old one off, putting the new one on, and tightening the tensioner bolt that you can see right there. Now the alternator belt was tight, but the other belt wasn't for some reason. It was probably one of those things that I said I'd get back to the next day and I never did, so I made sure to tighten that before we tried cranking the engine over. At this point we had made some very good progress, however there was one very important thing we had not done yet. If you remember in the last episode I fitted the manifold and the turbo on, however I didn't put any gaskets on any of the surfaces. Unfortunately it is a bit tricky to find an exhaust manifold gasket for this engine, however Smart Part manufacturers did send out this gasket material, which is actually super helpful because I'm making a custom turbo kit kind of, and I actually needed something like this in order to make the appropriate gaskets for the flanges which I designed. Speaking of that, basically what I did next was got the gasket material and tried my best to make some custom gaskets for the flanges. Do keep in mind, this was the day that I tried to get the car running for the first time in over 14 months, as I've kept saying, and I was rushing a bit making these gaskets. And because of that, I do think we will have to revisit this whole custom gasket idea because a lot of them turned out not very good. However, just to get the car running, these gaskets will definitely do. Once all the gaskets were done, it was time to reinstall the manifold and the turbo, and I also made this bracket, which I've mentioned in the last episode I thought I'd had to do, just to keep the oil hose away from the manifold. Once that was done, I carried on and changed the fuel filter for probably what was the first time ever for this car, and then I reconnected the starter motor, which I had disconnected because I was paranoid I'd crank the car over with no oil in the engine. And then it was time to put the car back down on the ground. And once all of that was done, the last thing we had to do before trying to start the car was change out the old plugs for these brand new lovely NGK spark plugs. Once again, very simple process. Remove the connector from the coil pack, remove the coil pack, remove the old spark plug, install the new one, and just put everything back. And then it was finally time.
3, 2, 1. You should have kept going, it was about to.
Are you sure there's fuel going through the lines?
We then proceeded to check if there's fuel and fuel pressure, which there was a lot of both. Enough to spray petrol in our eyes, so we decided to call it a day. Right, so it is now the next morning. Last night we were kind of rushing, trying to get it to start, and it didn't. We thought the fuel lines were airlocked, so we pulled off a fuel line to see if there's fuel pressure. And there was plenty of pressure, enough to spray petrol into our eyes. We're all right, but yeah, we decided to call it a day. I think I know why it's not starting. We definitely missed out on something. It could be a very simple fix, or it could not. But I think I know what's wrong with it. I was planning on doing an outro before we tried starting the car last night, but we were rushing and I forgot to do it. With that being said, I'm going to do an outro now because I want the video of the car's first start to be a separate one. But in the next episode, you guys are going to see this running and driving, and I'll tell you guys what was wrong with it. If you've made it this far, I assume you want to see this thing running and driving. I do too. So make sure to subscribe. Also check out the Instagram and the TikTok because updates are going to be there more frequently. And I'll do my best to get the next episode out as soon as possible. And with that being said, I gotta go figure out what's wrong with this, and I'll see you in the next one.